So very good morning everybody, and welcome to this session of the VCCircle Health Investment Forum. I think this is an annual event which is most sought after by both entrepreneurs, private equity funds, promoters, founders. It's a great melting pot of everybody who's out there in the healthcare sector. So congratulations for putting it all together once again. When we look at healthcare delivery, and particularly I'm sure that as the sessions go by today, there is the entire session build-up has been broken into the healthcare delivery side, new innovative models, and obviously the pharma and the life sciences side. So I think in this particular session, we'll focus a lot more on the healthcare delivery side and the big format healthcare delivery, so that we get a little bit more in depth in terms of what's working out there and what's not working out there. I think from a private equity standpoint and from a funding standpoint, the last 2-3 years for the healthcare sector and from an investment perspective have been tremendously good. There is tremendous amount of euphoria around healthcare. The macroeconomics, as we all have been thinking about them, there's a huge demand-supply gap. So obviously, healthcare in this country seems to be a limitless opportunity for future growth. The fact that between 2012, 13, 14, and also between 2011, each year we are seeing almost the doubling of deals happening and more than $1 billion being put behind the delivery side over the last 2-3 years each year, just goes to show that there is tremendous interest on the investing side. I think as Saad said in his opening comments, it's all about the fact that how is execution happening over there, and that's what is really going to be the big nirvana in terms of the capital being deployed and the execution happening. Both are growing simultaneously, so there is value creation happening across the sector, which I think from a sector perspective is also essential, because we probably are one of those beasts in town which do both social and economic good together. And that is a very sweet spot to be in. It's tremendous satisfaction on one side in terms of ramping us infrastructure in a sector where there is a huge supply need. But more importantly, there is also that big opportunity of doing social good with economic good. And that's a very, very important part of the conversation. So let me start with, Samir, in terms of the work that's happening currently on the Rockland side, and the question therefore for players like you who are metro-centric and now have growth opportunities being exploited, particularly in the tier 2, in the whole space of the tier 2 space. Where do you see yourself? Where do you see opportunities opening up on the delivery side? And where are also some of the challenges? Because I think this entire tier 2 opportunity, we all keep talking about it. How much execution out there is really happening in terms of creation of good value in the tier 2 cities?
So Vishal, to start with, I think one thing which has happened in last 3 or 4 years, the definition of tier 2 has changed. 5 years back, or maybe 6 years back, when we were doing a hospital in Jaipur during Fortis times, Jaipur used to be a tier 2 city. And now Jaipurs and Punes, they are almost like metros. So doing up a hospital in those cities is very, very easy. So now tier 2 has shifted down to places like Agras and Gwaliors and Jabalpurs and Bhopals of the world. But there are opportunities, but nothing much on the delivery side has been happening. I think the reason being one, availability of doctors for sure. That's one part of it. And second, patient as such, they want some completeness in the care. So if you were to do up a same model which you are doing in a metro town into a tier 2, which is a Agra or the Jabalpur, then there's a cost issue. How do you manage cost, and would those amount of investments be good enough for that kind of town, because payment mechanisms are not yet there. But having said that, I think there is a huge opportunity in tier 2 towns. We have to get the model right, something which is replicable, something which is not very large, and you have to choose those specialties very nicely. In India, there are certain specialties for which people still travel. They will keep on traveling. But that that 90% of the healthcare, which can be delivered in almost everywhere, has to be available to these guys. The OTs have to be good, the ICUs have to be good, rest everything can be put in place.
So are you finding from a supply creation perspective, in terms of how the competitive landscape is shifting in the tier 2 cities? And do you see more and more players coming in, or there are very few players who have sort of, or the corporate side of the players who have made early entries in the tier 2 cities? So is the landscape changing, or the landscape is still very much less organized, but the larger corporate players have still not sort of made aggressive entries?
Corporate players haven't made it, but I think those standalone small chains, which are 2-3 hospitals, they are trying to get in. What is also happening is a lot of doctors are turning into entrepreneurs. They have been to metros and they are trying to replicate something which is smaller in size, getting them together. So what I feel over next 5 years, you would see a lot of these doctors doing up hospitals in some way, smaller chains getting into these places, and then some consolidation will happen, and that's when the corporate groups, the larger chains, would try to get into it. Second, the bigger issues with larger chains is there's a difference in the way you do business in, say, a Delhi or a Bangalore and Bombay versus doing it in these places. So a lot of these larger chains have tried doing it, replicating the same model. It never works that way.
So good, stay with me. So, from a Max perspective, in terms of the way that you are looking at, and obviously, and that's the point that I was leading to, that many of the large corporate players have sort of remained more metrocentric. And so, I've done a lot of this in my previous life, and the metros have their own attraction point. Now, where, in your scheme of things and the thought processes, where does the entire opportunity of future growth continue to reside? Do you still feel metros are relatively untapped, and so therefore there is a lot more to be done there, and then probably make entries into the tier 2 cities?
So, Vishal, the way I look at it is the classical definition of defining towns has to change in the Indian context. A national capital region is the size of Malaysia, right? So we should stop thinking about towns as towns, they become countries.
Correct.
Point number one. I think the second point I want to make is, even the, you rightly said, the tier 2, tier 3 definitions are changing rapidly. Depends on which highway comes where and the nature of the town changes. I will actually say that the way, at least personally, I look at opportunities is not from the capital side, but from the supply of talent side. Which are the towns where talent is either available or is willing to relocate? To give you an example, we have a hospital in Dehradun, right? It's probably the only hospital of its kind in Dehradun and in the Uttarakhand belt. Now, Dehradun is tier 2 classically, but it is a great place to stay. People like the climate, people like to go there, doctors like to shift to Dehradun, the education system is fantastic, so schooling is available. So, I don't think we can look at healthcare or delivery in isolation of the quality of life towns offer. And I will rather shift this whole discussion onto zeroing in on those towns where this is possible. But last literally point I want to make is that at least we are very conscious of the practices that we will participate in and which we don't want to participate in, right? And the moment you go beyond a certain category of towns, there are market practices which at least we don't feel comfortable being a part of. Now the bet you have to take is how much you can change that practice being a larger player in that market versus how much you will get subsumed by it. So 3 essentially points from my side is that the NCRs, the Mumbais, the Bangalores of the world are large mini countries actually. The tier 2 question is a redundant question if it's a bad quality of life in a large city, right? And we can immediately visualize some of those.
So are we then saying that, because talent, and which is a constant conversation in our world right now, the talent is going to continue to be in short supply. So are we then saying that wherever the talent movement from the bigger metros to the smaller cities is not going to happen, those cities are eventually not going to grow and get better healthcare? So is that hypothesis correct, or there is latent talent which is sitting in many of these so-called tier 2 cities or the emerging metros, as one would say, and there are tons of them in India. And how do you exploit that talent base which is already existing in these geographies?
Again, that is not an absolute statement that there's no talent available. Depends on what model you want to play in, between primary, secondary, tertiary and quaternary. Right? I certainly don't think tertiary and quaternary talent is available in those towns to the extent that is required to run a fairly large setup. Primary and secondary is. So over time, the model which will probably be more sustainable is to have high quality primary and secondary centers in towns where talent is available of a certain variety, feeding into larger tertiary and quaternary facilities, which may not be necessarily in Delhi or Mumbai, but is in the next point of aggregation.
So I want to, and sorry to stop you here, what I want to also ask you is your enterprise has been the one which started that model of going from and try and tap the entire value chain of healthcare delivery. You were the early players to get into the primary care model, then grow it, into smaller institutions, then grow into the larger institution. So obviously there is an experience sitting out there. So, and there are lessons sitting out there in terms of thus straddling the entire value chain, actually go and create a lot more value in the overall term, or over a period of time this sort of gets bucketed and those who do primary care well should only stick to that and those who create better tertiary and quaternary care institutions should stick to that. So what's the overall experience out there?
So two answers. One is that the centers which are now primary for us were secondary and tertiary in a decade back, right? It's the evolution of the healthcare market which is also caricatures certain centers in a certain way. Second is, I do see an opportunity for even a player like us across the entire spectrum of value chain, but what kind of assets and which model you take to which town and which part of India has to be very, very deliberately thought through. Plonking models which work in a certain metro into another geography, which is clearly, and by the way, talent is not just doctors. The shortage of even paramedics, technicians, nurses is quite acute. So you have to really.
So we'll come to that.
Yeah.
Vishal, again moving forward to the same question. Hinduja Hospital here in Bombay, a towering presence, one of the early players to create a very, very differentiated approach, right? Has sort of stuck to that model over a long period of time. Growth has happened, but has happened fundamentally in one institution, and you've now set your first model outside of the first hospital. So from your perspective, and again having seen that model very intricately for many years, what has really been the core success factor around what Hinduja stands for today, and what has sort of made it emerge into a winner that it is in this particular market particularly?
Right. So like you said, we've been one of the first players, and what's worked for us and something that's very close to our hearts and as a business is that we've stuck to our core values. So whether it is the ethics we function with, the transparency we function with, we've stuck to that. And that something for us is, it's almost as if it's sacrosanct. So just like Rohit was mentioning today, even in urban areas, you've got all sorts of market practices, you've got all sorts of doctor practices, various scales. So if the aim is simply to scale up in number of beds, I'm sure you can add maybe 1,000 beds in a few months. But having seen it from both sides is the inside story is very different. So even from the investment point of view, earlier these businesses were evaluated predominantly only on the financials, only on the balance sheet. But being doctors and having been through that system, you realize that that's only it's only the tip of the iceberg. The actual challenges lie all below that. So for us, always that has been a focus, but now that we have evolved, we've seen this model working. Again, if you look at it from the point of view of need to be addressed, there's no doubt about the fact that we have to expand, you have to have facilities in the smaller towns, in the rural areas. But if you look at it from the business model, I honestly don't think anyone has really made that hub and spoke model, as we call it, really click. So while there are groups which have centers, but I doubt it's really functioning in the ideal hub and spoke manner in which it should, for various reasons, right from talent, right from how do you incentivize work to come there, how do you address the other issues we face. So as a model, it hasn't really clicked. So a lot of us are trying, a lot of us are experimenting various different models, but it still all has to fall in place so that it works into the ideal thing, and then you can scale up. Once that model is perfected, I think then you can probably extrapolate it into various towns.
So I'm glad you're the first one who has actually said that there are things which are not working, right? And we all couch ourselves under carpets and think that everything above that is working perfectly well. So, so let's, from your perspective, and I guess that's the enterprise which has sort of done that good balance of economic and social good. Return on capital has probably never been an issue, right? I'm sure Siddharth doesn't agree with that, and we'll talk to him now. But because when return on capital is not one of the biggest issues, do you think healthcare models in those kind of scenarios can be perfected better, or you think when you also have a good financial metrics in place, it actually pushes you and drives you to do that much better?
So if you were to look at most of the innovative or interesting models that have evolved, not many of them have evolved from the pure finance perspective. So a lot of it even today is by the passion of a certain doctor or a thought he has for doing a broader good, which then in retrospect is evolved into a financial model. So even today, if there is innovation that has to happen purely from the commercial viability sense of it, I doubt we can do any interesting stuff. We'll still have to stick to what has worked. This many beds, this specialty, this is the mix, and that's it. But sadly, not all of it can be straight jacketed in that fashion. So the innovation has to come from the thought and the ambition and the desire to do larger good. But at the same time, the way today we are evolving, it's finally a business we have to run. So at the end of the day, it has to be commercially viable. If it isn't, it's just not doing anyone any good. So today, arriving at that right balance is where the challenge is. So for instance, yes.
Thanks, Vishal. So great segue to talk to the man with the greenbacks in his pocket, right? So you've been, as a fund, you've been one of the early ones to look at healthcare. You guys have made a lot of investments in the space from different models perspective. So it would be good to sort of understand from a financial viewpoint and also from an investor viewpoint that how have you seen the sector evolve? Which areas within the sector, and I'm sure that there are many entrepreneurs sitting over here who continue to seek private equity and are still trying to balance out as to what is the best time to actually reach out to a fund and say, this is the time that I need to now move up and probably get an external investor in. So how do you see the sector from that perspective? And then I'll come back to a couple of other questions around heated valuations and things like that. So how have you seen the evolution happen?
Yeah, I think it's really surprising to think about this sector 8 years ago, and there was hardly any limelight on the sector. People were really struggling to expand. The guys who were doing well, but now I think we have a very vibrant ecosystem in place. The original game where investors were investing in tertiary care facilities has now become a very large scale game. The ticket sizes have become much larger. At the same time, what has also happened is that there's been a lot of innovation, and it's very topical to talk about low cost innovation with the Mars mission, but that's actually been happening within our healthcare sector.
Correct.
And it's been happening across. So, you have the single specialty models, which are all about a lot of process efficiency, getting the cost down. You've also had the corporate hospitals, all the tertiary care facilities innovating things like beating heart surgeries. We heard Dr. Sangeeta Reddy of Apollo talk about it. It was basically driven by the need to reduce costs, and it's become sort of the norm. It's being done everywhere in the country. So I think this, and clearly we all know the demand side story, and so it's a very attractive area for investors to come in. On some of the issues, I think the panel discussed on talent, tier 2 cities. I think those are very relevant. We found the hub and spoke model doesn't work. It's easy to sort of justify a spoke and say, it doesn't make money, but it sort of sends a lot of people into the hub. but we haven't been able to find any evidence of that. Having said that, people are coming up with standalone profitable spoke models, so to say. One very good example is Aster DM, which operates out of the Middle East and Southern India. In the Middle East, they run a primary care business, clinics business, which is very, very profitable. And the reason for that, and it offers a great value. I'm sure most of us agree as consumers. You would love to go, if you fall ill or your family member falls ill, want to go to a corporatized primary care chain where you get excellent service. The problem in India has been the price points. They've just been too low. And there's this whole issue of, is it a business or is it a social good that's being offered? And I think people are, over a period of time, becoming clear that the provider, the doctors, the professionals in this space also need to make money. And I think over a period of time, people are already trying out primary care models, and this will sort of pan out as well.
So can I ask you, I'm sorry to interrupt in between, because I'm sure that there are a lot of players over here who are trying to innovate the models, right? And sometimes we have this tendency to pick up models which have sort of worked fairly well in some of the other countries and try and transport them in the Indian context. I've seen many of them not really do well, basically because the price point realizations in India are very, very different than the price point realizations of many of the other countries, right? And so even if one takes a look at the Middle East, the price point realization on a per consult basis is probably 3 times or 4 times that what you get over here, and that model works very, very, very differently. So from an investor viewpoint, when you take a look at a couple of these models, which are great innovative models, I think the conversation that probably would need a lot more clarity over here is that is it important to replicate a model, or is it important to put the right financial metrics behind it when you're starting off with the model itself? So how do you see it from that context? So, and because you talked about primary care, and that's the reason I intervened over here, because there are multiple players who are currently looking at primary care models in this country. And I'm sure that many of them are finding it financially unviable. And as an investor, you will then go to those same players and say, I love your model, but I just don't like the financial metrics behind it.
Yeah. No, I think that's the billion-dollar question. How to figure out which innovative model is going to work. I think there are some general truths which you can rely on. Will primary care in a corporatized form take off in India? The answer, I think, is yes. The question is when. Will it be 15 years, 20 years? And so, you can run a business, lose money for 10, 15 years, and then it takes off. So I think the key component of this question which needs to get answered is, when is the tipping point? And I think that's a very challenging question in India, and people have been surprised because, there is a general feeling within investors that there is a tipping point which is coming. People value convenience, people value good services, and are willing to pay the additional premium if it is more efficient in terms of the experience, in terms of the time they spend trying to get that service.
So Siddharth, let's stay there, right? And because there is a much bigger question around valuations and things like that around a couple of these. I would also request all of you, in the interest of time, to just send in your questions. There are ushers all across the room, so instead of us getting up and asking questions, you could probably write them down so that we can do some time efficiency check over here. So I'm coming back to you, Rohit, in terms of probably one of the earlier groups to have a foreign international investor in, and who now probably owns, the majority stake in your company.
Equal stake.
Right, an equal stake. Hopefully, we will see different days coming in front. But I think a great move at the right time in terms of ensuring that somebody is there as a partner out there who brings in, value not just from a capital perspective, but others too. So how has that experience been? And because again, I think that's one big question that everybody has in terms of that there are a lot of strategics out there in the rest of the world who are looking at India and saying, great market, whom do I really go and partner with? and what works in a partnership and what doesn't really work. So, I would love to hear your comments on that.
So I think one of the things which as a group, am I audible? Yeah. One of the things as a group which we have a good strength on is actually managing joint ventures very well. So on the insurance side, we had a joint venture, two very successful joint ventures. Coming to healthcare, our experience has been fantastic for a variety of reasons. One, they're extremely experienced. They run about 8,000 beds in South Africa, right? They are one of the top two. At the same time, you need to find a partner who very well recognizes what can be transported in terms of expertise and what cannot be transported. And that openness of dialogue is very, very helpful because it leads to mutual value creation. So, short answer is that this is, I think, beyond capital. It is the ability to have liquidity for future growth jointly is a big motivator. Two, there are many areas where you have synergies which are truly global in nature now. For example, medical equipment purchase. It's completely global. There is no difference between a Lenac somebody is buying in South Africa or UK or India at this point in time. Right? So some of those synergies are very interesting and are beginning to play out. Third is even in talent exchange programs, because I keep coming back to talent because I face it day in and day out on a daily basis how tough the talent situation is in the healthcare industry. Ability to provide alternate career tracks to talent through a much wider network beyond India, while not necessarily plonking huge amounts of capital into doing that into markets where you may not want to be ultimately. So net, it's the fourth major joint venture we have in the last 10 years across the group, and they've been now there for 3 years. The stake increase is a validation of how they feel about us and how we feel about them, and it's been fantastic. I just want to put one thing on the table is joint venture management is tough. It's not easy. It's tough. It's an art and a science. It's on the Oriental side, it is as much an art as a science. It's about relationships. It's about being comfortable with each other and spending a lot of quality time understanding each other's business and aspirations, which really makes it tick.
So good, Rohit, and I think that's the big question out there in terms of that. Many times when you look at some of these partnerships panning out, most often than not, it starts with capital, and many partners think that it is all about capital. But I guess relationships with strategic players are far beyond capital.
Absolutely.
Right? And I think that's the big question out here in terms of that. While there is tremendous interest of many of the strategic players to get into India, I think partnership management is one of the key and the big key issues in terms of those who manage partnerships well, both from the capital point of view, from a talent perspective, from technology perspective. Those institutions will continue to find a lot of strength from a combination of two, rather than just looking at capital and say, as long as I have capital coming in, I'm absolutely fine, because that will continue to keep me growing, and I don't need anything else besides that. So coming back to Vishal, I think the big question in healthcare has always been around quality. And I think the debate around quality is increasing more and more now. And from an investor perspective too, there are a lot of questions today being asked more intricately than what they were in the past, in terms of the quality standards, in terms of good governance, in terms of both clinical and managerial governance. So, a group which has sort of really done a lot of work and basically puts a lot of emphasis on quality. Some of the experiences that you would like to share. And secondly, also, I think in the early days, your group had some level of international collaboration with a few of the international players on the quality side. How has that experience been?
Right. So there's no two thoughts about the fact that quality is one of the cornerstones in healthcare, but that in a way makes healthcare different from many other sectors out there. So while a lot of groups have tried geographical expansion, picking up various assets, different business models. The biggest challenge there is how do you standardize and push that same level of quality across that entire spectrum. And that's no easy task. So to get to a level like you talk of McDonald's where every store, the experience is the same, their style of functioning is the same. Healthcare, one, I don't think you can ever get to that level of standardization in healthcare. Being a service industry, it's not a product, the doctors are different, the nurses are different. So again, how do you standardize that quality across? And I am of the view that no one has really managed to do that to the extent that we need to. So part of the problem is that you have different, you take over different practices, different doctors, you working with those partnerships. And being a doctor myself, I can vouch for the fact that doctors are not easy people to partner with. So having said that, it becomes more and more challenging. And they always look at a manager with a bit of suspicion. So that comfort, although it's happening now, I'm sure Siddharth can shed some more light on it. But yes, that comfort, a manager or a financer versus a doctor, it's always a little bit of a challenge, and that needs to be ironed out. So while quality, yes, is definitely important, it's easier to drive it down one single large institution, but very difficult to replicate that over several hospitals in diverse geographies, maybe even diverse countries. So that is again one of the challenges we all face. So while you will have systems, you will have standard operating procedures as we talk, but it's very difficult to implement, very difficult to monitor, and very difficult to ensure that a patient walks into a hospital of a particular chain and gets exactly that same experience no matter where he goes to. So that is again one of the differences healthcare has maybe with other industries which we're all working on, but it's still a very tough challenge for all of us.
So you fundamentally believe that standardization,
Yes.
which is the holy grail of large networks,
Right.
right? That all the large networks continue to focus a lot more around standardization. And that is something which is one of probably the biggest execution challenges in healthcare,
Right.
that you continue to standardize yourself from unit to unit.
Right.
And probably the efficiency and the productivity which goes with standardization is still to be unlocked as far as the Indian healthcare sector is concerned, right? So that's one of the big opportunity plays that we see in the sector, that if anybody who comes in there and continues to create that level of standardization will probably do not just better, particularly in terms of margins and productivity. So, so that final question, more from the perspective of our capital markets continue and have gone into a big spin on the upward side, right? Public markets are doing well, and hopefully with the way that things are happening in India right now, there's a huge buoyancy that, India's real growth story is going to emerge over the next couple of years. Obviously, private capital, public markets, the conversation has begun to happen in terms of heated valuations and expectations being very, very high. So where do you see, and I think that's the big question out here in the room too. Valuations tend to, particularly in our country right now, are getting into a status where future growth around the assets, sometimes on a spreadsheet basis, is not really creating enough value. So experiences, what would your advice be? And to everybody sitting over here, one is around the model of tertiary care, primary care, which we just debated. But where do you see this? And because obviously exit options are going to open up. The good thing is that today everybody is beginning to talk about IPOs, and there's a potential exit that people are now beginning to see under the IPO format. So where do you see some of the valuation issues?
Yeah. So, let me focus on two topics which we've already sort of picked up, which sort of play into this whole valuation story. The first is about quality, and quality will be valued highly. And so if you are a regional chain running 2 hospitals, and you want to raise money from investors, and the question you're facing is, should I cut a few corners and show a higher profitability versus sticking to the kind of quality metrics I need to have? I think investors are clearly saying go the quality route. Okay, that's not to say that you have a cost inefficient model, but clearly there's value for quality. I think the second issue is that most of healthcare is a long gestation period business, and So thinking that because the markets are high, you will get a valuation. The investors, at least who've been doing this for a while, know that these things change over time. And if you're building a hospital, you need somebody who can really stay with you the course of the 5, 6, 7 years. You need to get it to a stable operating position. And these two have started to play a very, very important role. If you look at the top few chains who are much larger, when they go and look at the regional chains which they look to acquire, what are they looking for? They're looking for, are there good practitioners? What is the quality? Everything else they can manage. And I think that starts becoming the driver of valuation. So I guess, valuations will be high. Investors will have to determine which are the lemons and which are the good assets. And I think quality will play a huge role. Entrepreneurs, on the other hand, will also realize that it's good to have somebody who stays with you through the thick and thin, because this is a slightly longer term play. And so how important are the headline valuations versus somebody who can really partner with you and say, hey, don't take shortcuts, because doctors also don't want to take shortcuts. That's our experience. They want to do the right thing, but they face financial pressures too. So if you have an investor who can support you in that, I think there is a reasonable win-win transaction. There are a lot of win-win transaction possibilities even today.
So, and that's a good point to probably end the conversation on. And, just my two-bit advice over here is that as one begins to look at many of the healthcare players out there from a funding perspective, I think leaving something, and this is a very typical financial jargon, right, that leaves something on the table for future growth. Because everybody tries to maximize valuation in tranche one. And what then happens is that if you do not really perform to that level, then your future tranches only get more and more tougher.
Yep.
Right? And that's where this entire issue around heated valuation, that what good looks on spreadsheets today necessarily does not translate into good business in the future. And it is that breakthrough company which is able to put together the right spreadsheet of its future growth and is able to stick to that plan and execute to that plan seamlessly is probably going to be the darling of the investor world in the future. And that's where doing the right mix and not necessarily going in with a very aggressive stand in the first entry point will probably create a more sustainable, a more profitable, and a great company which probably will find multiple exit points for its founders, for its investors, and for also its management in more ways than one. And so I think that's something that we should all be thinking about in terms of as we put together new business plans for our creation of a better future. We have tons of questions out here. I probably have just 5 minutes. So we will quickly take snapshot questions and try and see if which is the one which really takes a lot more thinking. You're talking about internet and and obviously the entire impact of social media, the entire push around the Internet of Things and where that is going to play out. So anybody wants to take a quick shot at it? Anybody who's sort of experimented with it and believe, Samir, would you like to take a shot in terms of where do you see that and how do you see the role of internet impacting future growth?
I think social media, internet would play a big role. We have seen business already coming in from that perspective to the hospitals. But having said that, these two can actually be delinked. The e-healthcare, so-called, would be really big. Be it on social media or pure play internet. You would see a lot of e-healthcare sites coming in, whether it's consultations or second opinions. All those things would come in, and they would eventually link into the healthcare delivery per se, but they would be standalone as well, for sure.
So we should be seeing some Flipkart of the world coming into healthcare, right? So that's good news out there. Let's talk.
One more point here. I think there is an efficiency imperative, appointments online, saving people time and all that. But I think there's a bigger thing here. There is huge information asymmetry in the healthcare industry.
Correct.
You're going to a practitioner. Do you have adequate information? What is the success rate of the guy? I think there are a few very interesting companies which are looking at aggregating information, and so you could have a play where there are counseling services. You want to get a knee replacement done. You're 65 years old. You're located in this location. What's the best option for you, or which is the best
and also, if you look at most of the startups which are happening in the space right now and are getting incubated what connects the patient to the clinician,
Absolutely.
the patients to the provider. So I think it's becoming one of the key imperatives of future growth. Specialization, and I think this is a good one in terms of, and Siddharth, coming back to from an investor viewpoint, we've seen a lot of multi-format, multi-specialty investments happen. And where do you see the next wave? Do you see it in more specialized, small format institutions, 150 beds, 200 beds, around single specialties? Do you think that's the kind of model that one would like to invest in into the future?
Yeah. So, I think the single specialty space is going to be driven by cost. However, personally, I'm not that big on specialization, because specialization, I think, still from a business format perspective, will happen in the large institutions, because medicine is becoming collaborative. It is no longer, when you're getting a cardiac surgery done, it's not just about the cardiac specialty. Or you look at some of the chronic diseases like diabetes. You need multiple clinicians working together in various specialties coming together. And I think that will continue to remain the holy grail, because that's a model which puts the customer at the center and not the specialty of the clinician. So I think, there will be movement in both directions, but I don't see the multi-speciality, tertiary care, holistic approach going away anytime soon.
Good. I think there are a lot of questions, from the audience in terms of the impact that insurance is going to make, right? And all of us continue to play on insurance as one of the biggest key drivers of future growth for the Indian healthcare sector, that as third-party payment mechanisms mature, there is going to be this huge explosion for healthcare needs which is going to happen. It also comes with its own issues. So I think from the provider side, quick question first to you, Rohit, in terms of, because you as a company, you also play in insurance, both on the life and the health side. So macro, good, anything at the micro level which you believe is not going to be the big opening point for insurance over here, in terms of there are any watch out issues?
I think the watch out issues are likely to be in when insurance goes beyond hospitalization, and what is the model to really achieve that. In many markets, OPD, other home care are covered in insurance. In India, it's incredibly tough given the kinds of practices which exist. So I do see emergence of closed loops where the provider, the payer and the consumer are in a guaranteed space from an ethical perspective.
Correct.
For insurance to play out. Those markets, so by the way, that's a cat and mouse or a chicken or egg situation right now. If there was a nationwide, I don't mean the brand, I mean nationally, there was a chain of primary clinics, it would have been easy to do that for an insurer. But today that doesn't exist. So an insurer can tie up with 4 clinics in Delhi and 4 clinics in Bangalore, but what happens to the rest?
So do we see, so do we see, there is a lot of movement in the insurance sector today, and particularly with liberalization and with the entire FDI issues getting sorted out on the insurance side, one will see a lot of international players coming in. And so does that mean that from a consumer standpoint and also from a provider standpoint, we are going to see a lot of more coverage happen, but it will also bring in a lot of new governance?
It is already happening. So
Right.
the insurance space today has close to 50 companies operating, because the life companies can also offer health products.
Correct.
Of albeit of a different nature. So competition is already very intense, but the competition is largely in the same segment. Right?
So do you see the segment expanding? So, right now we are still seeing insurance, inpatient, hospitalization. You see that one-off insurance company turning around and saying, I will cover your existing illnesses. So are you really seeing the creation of new products around health insurance? Coverage of primary care, coverage of pre-existing illnesses, coverage of disease-specific illnesses. Do you see a lot of that emerging?
It is happening. It's already happening. We have for example, on the Max Mobile, we have a product which covers up to 13 members in your family for a variety of things. It's all about pricing it right and getting the products going. Last 1 year has seen many new launches in the insurance space Those products are not big yet, but small experimentation in terms of product design is not a matter of it will happen, it is already happening.
So time's up, but I still have a couple of questions over here, and I wouldn't like to take away the time from the second panel. There are a lot of questions over here which is talking about other formats beyond specialty hospitals, multi-specialty hospitals. I think if you see the agenda of the conference for the next couple of sessions, you will have a lot of discussion points around other formats, daycare, primary care. There is a huge segment in terms of new formats, dialysis, nephrology play. So just wait and watch. I think the rest of the sessions are going to be pretty interesting. Thank you very much to all the panelists for an exciting first session, and thank you for your time. Thank you very much.